Well, hello everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to TNC's latest Down the Wire podcast, and today's topic is an absolute cracker: how network transformation goes wrong and how to prevent it. I'm John Waterhouse, CEO of TNC. I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. As I'm sure everyone joining knows, TNC is the UK's largest independent network and telecoms strategy and sourcing consultancy. We support over 280 major UK multinational organisations and help them get the best possible commercial, technical, operational and contractual results from their network and telecom solutions. Joining us today to share his expertise is one of our most experienced principal consultants and lead deployment expert, Jonathan Copley. John, would you like to say hello to our viewers and listeners?
Hello, viewers and listeners.
Great to have you. Great to have you. Now, I've had a sneak peek of our forthcoming white paper on this topic, and I know it is extremely interesting. In fact, I'm going to open our podcast today by quoting from the opening paragraph of that paper. Picture the scene. You've just completed the procurement of your organization's new network solution. The business case you presented to the CFO showed a pretty rosy picture, and the final results you've achieved more than align with what you've promised. A next-generation technical solution that delivers more bandwidth, more resilience, and more functionality. A step up in SLAs with an improved operating model, all delivered with significant cost savings. You're a hero, right? High fives all round. But let's roll the tape forward a year. Did all those benefits really happen? Did the network really get deployed on time? Does it really perform as expected? Most importantly, the CFO is having trouble identifying the cost savings, and she's asked for a report from you to prove they landed. This might sound like a nightmare. We really should have done this as our Halloween podcast, shouldn't we? This might sound like a nightmare, but unfortunately, it is the reality for far too many network transformations. The good news is, though, we have John here, grizzled veteran of dozens of such transformations, and he's going to talk us through exactly where such transformations can go wrong, and most importantly, what you can do to avoid that terrible fate. So, Mr. Copley, let's start with the ugly truth. In your white paper, you quote 3 pretty shocking stats about how transformations go wrong. Can you start off by upsetting our viewers and listeners and reminding us of those stats?
I surely can. Let's get the bad news out of the way to start with. So firstly, I think on average we see deployments taking 6 months longer than the original plan, which is a hefty amount of time in anybody's book.
It's pretty painful to start with.
It is, and it doesn't get any better either. And during the time to procure and then deploy, 40% of organizations say that functionality, potentially doesn't meet some of the requirements that were a driver to deploy the new technology.
Because the requirements are changed, it's taken so long to buy it and deploy it that by the time you deploy it, it doesn't even do the thing that you set off to.
Correct.
Fantastic. Okay, good. You've more bad news?
My personal favorite, and I think the most shocking of all, is that 50% potentially forecasted savings are lost by the end of the deployment.
So from the time you promised your CFO savings in the business case to the time you've actually finished the deployment, half of those savings have disappeared.
Yeah.
Please
Don't
don't
sell to anyone.
Please don't stop listening now. We are going to talk to you about how to avoid this fate. But that's pretty shocking. So let's just recap that. The average deployment takes 6 months longer than planned. 40% of organizations find they've got a functionality shortfall at the end of the deployment. And 50% of cost savings can be lost between the business case and the end of the deployment.
Yep. That's statistics.
That is pretty grim. So, okay. What's driving that? Okay, I mean, that doesn't just happen, right?
No.
So I happen to know that we've been doing quite a bit of research into this space, and delayed deployment is obviously a huge part of this. Could you take us through what is causing all that delayed deployment?
I can, yeah. So I think where we would start is there's often a delay with the data, right? So when you start in your contract, you're doing your procurement, it all starts with that data set at the beginning. And typically what we see is the procurement data is quite high level. So site list, it literally site name, address. Pretty much that's it. When you come to deploy, you need much more detailed site information, and that gap in knowledge can be significant. And on a large estate, it can take a lot of time to gather that information, because a lot of organizations don't track the information that the vendors will need to deploy.
Okay, so it's not the lack of data that's the problem, it's the time it takes to go and get that data.
Yeah.
And we're talking here about getting right down to the kind of real detailed level, site contacts, names, phone numbers, email addresses.
Yeah, location of the comms room, those types of information, power, space, all that kind of good stuff.
All the super detailed stuff you're going to need as part of a deployment.
Yeah, and if you haven't got that, any delay on that, the vendors are off the hook, because that's a prerequisite that you'll sign up to. So it's really important that you start that data capture early.
And so presumably the key issue here is organizations aren't starting to gather that data until after they sign their contract. So at that point, the clock's ticking.
Yeah, because everyone's focused on getting a great deal, getting a great price, getting a great solution. They're not in the weeds of where we're going to plug it in.
Okay, interesting. And as you say, when you talk about big site lists, presumably that can take what, weeks, months?
Months, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, even on a site list of 100, it can take weeks to get the contact information, the phone number, the email of the LCON. You need 2 sets of contacts on site. Gathering all that data. You say organizations don't just have it sat there ready to give you. You have to go out and find that information.
Interesting. What's next? Okay, so getting the data. I can see the problem there. What's next?
So the next one is the solution development, right? So you've signed up to your product, SD-WAN, let's say, and you're doing your contract, you've negotiated it all, you've got your price, but all you're working from is a very high level description of the solution. You need to get down into the weeds of the low level design, how it's going to work, how it's going to function, what are your policies going to be like, what's your routing, what's this, what's that. And again, you don't get down into that detail until you've got a contract, and you've really got to allow time to gap to that. Because again, it's a massively time consuming piece of work.
Now, I'm a slight spoiler alert because I've read the white paper. One of the things you say there is that the challenge, as we're moving away from an old world of it was MPLS to a new world where quite possibly it's SD-WAN, the no more time is being baked into project plans to make to reflect that complexity. So what might have taken a couple of months in an MPLS world because everyone knew what they were doing is now taking much longer because there's more testing, there's more piloting, etc., etc. So is the reason that this process step is taking longer because we're having this technology change? So back in the days of MPLS, everyone knew it was going to take 2 months, say, to do this process step, and that's what goes in the project plan. But now it's world of SD-WAN, the technology is new, skills, knowledge, etc. are less developed, more testing, more piloting is required. So what took 2 months is now taking 4 months, and no extra time is being put into the project plan for that. Is that what's causing this?
Yeah, it's exactly that. Sticking with SD-WAN as an example, but the same can be said for any of the sort of new cutting edge bleeding edge technology. Is that the solution complex? There's lots of policies that need to be created, and they're all from scratch. They're not from new, and they're all bespoke to each customer. And there's a lot of thinking that has to be going in, and information that has to be captured from the customer side, which the customers aren't always ready for. So they have to then go into, well, what do we want our policy to be on watching cat videos on Facebook at lunchtime? Whatever it is.
Strongly encouraged.
You've got to go out and find that information, which takes time.
Yeah.
But then layered on top of that is the point that because it's such a new technology, we are seeing the vendors, they've got the capability, they've got the knowledge, but whereas in an MPLS world, for example, they've had 50 people on the bench who can deploy MPLS, and they've been doing it for years, and they can do it with their eyes shut to a certain extent. But with SD-WAN, they are still learning. They've got the knowledge, but instead of 50 people, they've got 5.
Yeah.
And the the delivery teams are deploying it, and when they hit an issue that they've not come across before, it's taking them time because they go, oh, I've not seen that before. So they have to go away internally, and because they're running multiple deliveries of SD-WAN at the same time, there's a bottleneck into the people at the back end.
I was going to say, you got bottlenecks and traffic jams all the way up the chain.
All the way up, which again, all these things get fixed, but it's just taking the time to get there.
And we're going to, when we come on to cost overruns, spoiler alert, that's what's coming next. We're going to talk about how this impacts. But let's just finish off with delays first, because again, things like SD-WAN. The next point here, we're talking about sort of hardware shortages and so on. Again, presumably that's exacerbated by the sort of the newness of the technology.
Yeah, and I think it's demand, because everyone's now deploying SD-WAN. It's definitely what we're seeing people buy, but then you overlay that sort of high demand anyway with the global chip shortage that we're seeing.
Yeah,
we are seeing impacts on deliveries, certainly on certain lines of hardware, and it's changing all the time. So it's really hard to plan in what that delay is going to be.
Yeah, I can see how that. This is all adding up to. We're I presume desperately trying to avoid using the term perfect storm, but it's a perfect storm, right? There's just a whole bunch of things happening all at the same time. And this last point here around project management failures, again, presumably this is all compounded by the same factors, that it's new, there's a shortage of people who know what they're doing, etc.
Exactly, yeah. And it's it's like any project, you've got to have that strong governance structures set up right from the start, with the clear roles and responsibilities, so everyone knows what they're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So okay, so I think it feels like we've sort of done to death the topic of delayed deployments, but there's a lot of things that a lot of organizations are going to experience which are contributing to delays. So look, we're going to come on now to the second part of this, and that's the cost impact of these things. Now, one could ask a pretty dim question. One could say, well, wait a second, I accept that things are taking longer, but why are they costing more? Take us through that. What is it about delay that then hits us all in the wallet?
Exactly. So the big one is increased dual running costs, right? So the longer you sit coloring in your profiles and finding out your information, all the things we talked about previously, you're not deploying your new network. And chances are you're deploying your new network because the new network's cheaper than your old network, and the longer it takes, so that cost, you're not getting the benefit. So start of the year, you set your budgets based on the fact we're going to be deploying. You're instantly up against it from a budget perspective because you've not hit that delayed dual running. Another element is if you're your legacy supplier, the chances are you bought a new network because your old network contract's coming to an end. Well, that's got a definitive end date, and there may be clauses in there, quite common in older network contracts, that there's a rollover, and it'll roll over for 12 months, potentially.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not only that, it's taking longer to get to the new network. You're dual running some elements of the new network with some elements of the old network, which you presumably haven't budgeted for, but quite possibly you could hit a kind of auto renewal or whatever it is. You've got to negotiate an extension to that contract, presumably on not particularly great terms, because again, one of the reasons you're leaving that supplier and that contract is you're perhaps not wild about them, and they're perhaps not wild about you if you just serve notice on them. So that's all pretty commercially tricky territory.
It is, yeah. And then it's not just the commercial elements. Indirect cost will go up potentially because you've got an uninterested supplier now who's firmly sat in the exit departure lounge, and they might take the eye off the service, so you need to put more service management resource on it. There's an indirect cost to this as well, not just a straightforward benefit.
Yeah, so this is pretty horrible stuff. What else? I know one of the things you talked about in the white paper is unexpected change control costs. What are you getting at there?
So go back to the sort of previous horror points we were talking about around the lack of data. Well, that can come back and bite you in the backside further down via change control, because You know, new sites going to come in. Maybe you didn't have all the data, so you've new sites. The problem is with that is you got to add them in by change control, and once that contract's signed, you're just dealing with one supplier. So, lack of information drives big issues in change control.
Yeah, and part of that presumably is as you're going through that discovery process, you're potentially also discovering requirements you didn't know you had, etc., etc.
Yeah, and all that takes time to test, and again impacts your delivery. You're back on the nightmare roundabout.
God, this is a spiral of horror, isn't it?
It's not great, is it? Yeah, yeah.
And so just conscious, if we're talking about the greatest hits of woe, your final point in this, and I absolutely love this one because it just sounds bonkers. You mentioned organisations not turning off legacy services. You can't be serious. Are you genuinely saying it's not just that it's taken longer to deploy the new service, but you're not turning off the old one?
You would not believe how common it is. It is unbelievable, and you'd think that'd be the first thing on any project manager's to-do list, right? Turn off old circuit.
Hey, listen. Clearly, I'm no project manager because it seems pretty obvious to me. Well, why not? I mean, come on, this seems crazy.
It does seem crazy, right? So when you're in the hustle and bustle of a large network deployment, there's a lot going on. It's complex, fast moving, and there's a long time, right? So the chances are your project manager was never involved in the business case, wasn't involved in the procurement, knows none of the history. All he knows is he's got to install new box, new circuit, get sites up and running without any impact in the budget envelope he's been set, right?
So he's focused on the new.
He's focusing on the new. And, 12 months later, that's a distant memory. And if it's not, if the governance isn't set up that we talked about before around that clear governance of roles and responsibilities, if no one's got that on their list of jobs to do, you'd be amazed. It just doesn't get done.
So so what you're saying is no one's kind of coming in behind and sweeping up. Everyone's running off after getting the new solution in.
Yeah.
But no, it falls through the cracks. It's someone's job
to
turn.
We've seen this on on WAN contracts, on voice contracts, all kinds of contracts. It's unbelievably common.
Now, having already pointed out that I'm no project manager. Presumably, though, it makes your business case an awful lot harder to achieve if you've gone from paying for one network to paying for two networks. Yeah. Okay.
And when you do get pulled up and you have to write that report for your CEO, we've just spotted that we should have turned it off 18 months ago. We've been paying for two.
And presumably, a little bit of sympathy for the project teams here. Presumably there's an element with this of, getting off the old network is pretty challenging, making sure all the services have really been transferred over. No one wants to accidentally create, a bit of downtime between the old and the new, etc. So presumably there's a lot of pressure on to be ultra careful with turning off the old solution. I can see how that could easily kind of segue from caution to, well, we never quite did it.
Yes, I mean, in a delivery phase, you'll always leave a period of dual running, which is what we're talking about with one of the costs earlier. You've got to set that dual running window appropriate to the risk that the client wants to sign up to. At the end of the day, service is king. You don't want to take a retail estate down. You don't want to take a manufacturing site offline. Whatever it might be. So you leave that dual running period there in case you need to fail back. There's a problem with the new circuit. Problem with whatever.
But presumably, the more caution, the longer it dual runs, the greater the risk that it kind of gets forgotten.
And the longer it dual runs, exactly. So if a customer says, right, we want 6 weeks dual running, not uncommon, then 6 weeks is a long time because they're now focusing on site A, B, C that doesn't work anymore. And they've got an issue with this policy that they need to focus on. And unless there's that clear role and responsible somebody's job to do that, just doesn't get done.
Wow. Okay.
Unbelievable.
unbelievable, but extremely interesting all at the same time. Okay,
Good.
so you scared us all half to death. Thank you. We did promise we wouldn't just leave it there though. We would talk about what can be done. Now, clearly, job one is find someone to go and turn off all the old stuff. But anyway, let's raise the level a little bit. Well, in the white paper, you talk about the top 3 things. I know you say there's 10, 12, 15 other things you could do, but talk us through the top 3 things that you would advise any organization to do is facing into a transformation.
So I mean, the good thing is, this stuff isn't rocket science, right? It's not massively over complex. It's just, you just need some good rigor and process around this. So, the first place to start is de-risking and doing that through better definition and requirements. It's not complicated. It's definitely not glamorous, but you've got to get all that information. Start building your site list, start building your contacts lists. Bake stages into your procurement process to refresh your data. Once you've done your RFP, refresh it again for the BAFO.
Yeah.
Then refresh it again for the contract signature before contract signature. So once you put that pen on paper, you've lost all that competitive tension that you've had through the rigor that you've really put into the procurement phase. But once you're talking with one supplier, if you suddenly need to add in a change of scope for a higher spec box, then you've lost that competitive tension. But if they know, well, actually, we could still go to supplier X because they'll give us a better price, you've still got that window.
Yeah, and presumably, once you put pen to paper, the business case is fixed. You've by then told the CFO or the CEO, this is how much it's going to cost. This is how much money we're going to save. You can't then rock up later on and say, "Oh, I was wrong."
Yeah.
So again, getting that done pre-signature. Okay,
yeah.
Cool. I like that. And you're right. It ain't glamorous.
It definitely ain't glamorous. No. But then once you've got those much more detailed set of requirements from a technical perspective, build in some proof of concept and value into it. Ideally before you sign the contract, or if not in the contract, once you signed it, a clause to get out if it doesn't work.
Well, I was going to say, so the next point I know you're going to talk about is this kind of, passing the risk back to the supplier. Yeah. Presumably things like POC, POV, pilots, etc. They're great opportunities to say, if it doesn't work, to your supplier, if it doesn't work, that's on you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's vital to pass on as much risk as possible. And when we say risk, what we're really talking about is cost, right? So you pass as much of that onto the supplier in the contract for things like, delays due to failure of POC testing, which we just talked about. Low-level designs taking longer than planned. All these things that we talked about earlier in the podcast was getting that contract protection in there to protect yourself.
So presumably, these aren't things you can think about a week before you sign your contract. You need to be planning from the day you start your procurement. You need to have the deployment in your mind.
Yeah.
And start these parallel processes.
Yeah, you're absolutely bang on there. The days of, just signing your contract and then going into delivery, that's just a recipe for taking another 6 months. I mean, your 6 months will go right before you know it. You got 3 month lead time on big circuits anyway. Yeah, you can do a lot of work in that time, but it takes longer than that to build, design, test.
Yeah.
It's definitely taking longer to do those things. And the information gathering, again, you can't place your order with a lot of vendors now until you've got all this information.
Yeah.
And again, they've got a get out of jail free card on any delivery. If you haven't given them those prerequisites, they'll just sit back and go, if you haven't got your site list, that's fine. We can't place an order and tell us, who we can contact in site in Azerbaijan. You need all that information.
Yeah.
So definitely start that, delivery phase while you're in the procurement phase.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm really disappointed to say we are running out of time on podcast, and we could be at this for another half hour. I dare say, if we're in the pub, we could be at this for another couple of hours. But
I'm sure we would. Intentionally, probably.
Absolutely. Yeah. But no, this is absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's some of these things. It sounds so counterintuitive, right? That, you're going to get a cost overrun because you're not going to turn the old network off. And people are going to say, well, of course we're going to turn the old network off. But the practical reality is this, you're going to have cost overruns because the solution probably won't do what it says it will do the first 1 or 2 times you go through testing. But hey, if you're working on anything next gen, UCAS, SD-WAN, whatever it is, it probably isn't going to work first time out of the box, etc. Unless you're baking these things into your process, you're going to end up in a world of pain. It's no wonder you've got those horror stats that we started the podcast with.
No, absolutely. No, the final thing to do is, I guess, be realistic. Build in some contingency into the plan. Don't take the happy plan approach that the vendor's selling you, saying, "Oh, we'll get your new network in 9 months. We'll get your new voice system in 6 months." Be realistic, especially if it's a new technology. Build in some contingency to allow for testing, to allow for changes, to allow for retesting.
Presumably yourself in a year's time who's making that long trip up to the CFO's office will thank your old self hugely for having stuck a bit of contingency into the plan.
Absolutely. And if it does work first time, never seen them work first time, but if it does work first time, then you're going back with good news rather than bad news, right?
Absolutely.
You're going up there saying we delivered early.
Yeah.
Rather than going upstairs going, we're 6 months late.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
John, fantastic, excellent, just really super interesting as always. I'm really sorry we're going to have to draw things to a close, but thank you so much for providing us with your insights. That's been really, really interesting. I'm sure everyone listening and watching has really enjoyed it. Please, as always, do let us know any questions you may have about this or any other network and telecoms topic. You can get in touch through our website, www.networkcollective.co.uk, or any of our usual social channels. We look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you very much, everyone.